Where do empires go to die? For 1,000 years, the sun never set on the legions of Rome. Their power was unquestioned, their legacy eternal. But in the year 636 AD, destiny chose a furnace of sand and stone in the Levant, a forgotten tributary called the Yarmouk River, to test that eternity. This was the ultimate reckoning, the old world, massive and mighty, against a fragile flame born of the Arabian desert. The Byzantine Empire, the greatest power of the age, was here to extinguish what they saw as a brief, desperate desert raid. They gathered an army that stretched to the horizon, an ocean of steel, perhaps 150,000 strong. They believed victory was guaranteed. They were wrong. Their rivals were few, perhaps 30,000 men, driven not by gold or territory, but by an unstoppable new faith. They came from the unforgiving emptiness, and they were led by the man Rome feared most. Before Yarmouk, there was Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of God, a commander whose name was already a whisper of doom throughout the Byzantine garrisons. He had campaigned relentlessly, transforming small skirmishes into dazzling victories across Iraq and Syria. But the Muslim forces were now overextended, isolated, and facing annihilation. In a desperate gamble, the Caliph ordered a consolidation. All Muslim forces scattered across the Levant were to abandon their conquests and converge on a single, defensible position, the plains of Yarmouk. But the greatest challenge wasn't the enemy surrounding them. It was the distance separating them from their leader. Khalid was needed immediately, but he was hundreds of miles away in Iraq. What followed was one of history's greatest feats of tactical movement, the impossible march. Khalid took a small elite squadron, perhaps 6,000 cavalry, and chose a route that mapmakers deemed impossible, a scorching wasteland, barren of water. The sun beat down like a hammer, the sand whispered of doom. But Khalid knew the secret pathways. He had studied the desert's cruel heart. He moved with blinding speed. When Khalid's weary, dust-caked column finally rode into the Muslim camp at Yarmouk, the morale of the defenders soared. The arrival of the Sword of God was worth 10,000 men. He immediately assessed the ground. This was not a fight for open terrain. This was a battle for survival, staged on a killing field he had carefully chosen. To the south was the river. To the east, the deep, impassable ravine, a natural trap. The Muslim camp was pitched at the center, anchored by the river. They could not retreat. It was victory or oblivion. The Byzantine commander, Theodore, saw a small army trapped. He saw numerical advantage. He saw history on his side. He just needed to crush them. For weeks, the two massive forces sat opposite each other, a terrifying, frozen standoff. The air grew thick with anticipation. Negotiations failed. The Byzantines tried bribes. The Muslims offered terms. Neither side would yield. Sleep was impossible. On the Byzantine side, they sharpened their spears, confident in their numbers, their heavy armor, their training. On the Muslim side, fear was a palpable presence. Every soldier knew the odds. They were outnumbered 5-1. They heard the endless chanting and the rhythmic drumbeats of the enemy camp. Khalid, however, spent the night not sleeping, but preparing. He restructured the entire Muslim army, breaking the traditional linear formation. He created tight, fast-moving cavalry squadrons, the Mobile Guard, designed to plug gaps and strike fast. He turned their numerical disadvantage into a test of speed and agility. He looked across the silent valley at the campfires of the enemy, an endless chain of light stretching into the darkness. He knew that numbers meant nothing if they could be broken, that confidence meant nothing if it turned to panic. The desert wind whispered promises of blood and glory, but also the chilling possibility of utter destruction. August 15th, 636 AD. Day 1. The waiting was over. The Byzantine army advanced, a terrifying, slow-moving tide of steel. Their objective: shatter the Muslim flanks with overwhelming force. The ground began to shake beneath the thousands of marching feet. The clash of empires was about to commence. A fragile force facing a tempest. Fear gave way to a hardened resolve. They drew their swords, adjusted their shields, and waited for the command that would determine the fate of Syria and the course of the next 1300 years of history. The first blow was thrown. The greatest battle of the early Islamic conquests had begun, but could courage alone defeat the crushing weight of Rome? The world had turned to fire and steel. Day 1 at Yarmouk was a brutal, grinding confirmation of the Muslim disadvantage. The Byzantine army delivered exactly the hammer blow they promised. The Muslim right flank buckled first. Wave after wave of armored Roman infantry smashed into the lighter armed Arabs. The line dissolved into a desperate, retreating scrum. Chaos reigned. Courage failed. Panic gripped the retreating soldiers. They fled towards the vulnerable camp where their families stood watch. But they didn't find safety. They found renewed fury. History often forgets the fury of the determined. The Muslim women, wives, sisters, daughters, refused to become spoils of war. Drawing knives and wielding tent poles, they met the fleeing men not with sympathy, but with contempt and blows. "Where are you going, coward?" they demanded. "Back to the battlefield, or stay here and face us." Humiliated, galvanized by their sheer desperation, the Muslim warriors pivoted. They turned back into the fray, fighting for their lives, their honor, and their faith. The flank was saved, but the lesson was stark. At Yarmouk, there was no retreat. This brutal lesson repeated itself over the next 5 grueling days. The Byzantines relied on the weight of their numbers. The Muslims relied on the genius of Khalid. He knew he couldn't fight a static battle. Rome's armies excelled at brute force. Khalid's forces excelled at speed. His mobile guard, that elite cavalry force he brought from Iraq, became the scalpel against the Roman sledgehammer. Whenever a section of the line wavered, Khalid would unleash a squadron, hitting the enemy flank with devastating surgical strikes before vanishing back into the dust. He rotated his units ceaselessly, ensuring no squad was exposed to the enemy's full fury for too long. He fought the battle like a chess master, sacrificing pieces to protect the king, keeping the massive Byzantine force constantly off balance, constantly exhausted. The sheer discipline of the Muslim army, under the most intense pressure imaginable, was legendary. They held the line. By day 6, the war had devolved into a test of wills. The Byzantines were tired of fighting shadows. They needed to finish this. Khalid knew this was the hour of destiny. He had preserved enough energy, enough speed, for a single, decisive blow. He studied the terrain, focusing on the left wing of the Byzantine line, closest to the terrifying gorge of Wadi al-Ruqad. He executed his masterpiece. First, the mobile guard, now concentrated into a single, unstoppable spearhead, struck the Byzantine cavalry flanks with terrifying force. The crucial Byzantine horsemen were shattered, routed, and driven from the field. The imperial infantry was now exposed, They had lost their vital protection. With the Byzantine cavalry gone, Khalid turned his attention to the unprotected Roman center. He ordered a massive coordinated attack, the kind of unified charge that only desperate men, led by a brilliant commander, could execute. The pressure turned inward. The Byzantine infantry, already exhausted, already demoralized, began to crumble. The Muslim warriors pressed the attack with the ferocity of men who knew this was their final chance. The Byzantine center began a disorganized, panicked retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The river was to the south, the battlefield was congested, and to the east, the deep, treacherous chasm of the Wadi al-Rukad yawned open, cunningly positioned by Khalid to become their executioner. They were pushed into the ravine by the thousands. They fell, screaming, into the dark embrace of the gorge. The mighty army of the Eastern Roman Empire, the force that promised to crush this desert rebellion, disintegrated into a horrifying tangle of men and armor. The great Byzantine general, Theodore, was killed. The purple banners of Rome were torn and trampled into the dust. The battle lasted 6 days. The destruction of the enemy lasted mere hours. When the morning silence finally descended upon Yarmouk, the scale of the victory was incomprehensible. The Muslim army had suffered significant loss, but the Byzantine army was utterly broken. The battlefield was littered with Roman dead, perhaps as many as 70,000 casualties. Yarmouk was not just a victory, it was an amputation. Within weeks, the remaining Byzantine garrisons in Syria fell. The ancient Roman province was lost forever. The Emperor Heraclius, watching from Constantinople, is said to have mourned, "Farewell, Syria, and what an excellent country this is for the enemy." The world had fundamentally shifted. A new empire, forged in the crucible of this desert valley, was born. The Battle of Yarmouk defined the world we inhabit today. It solidified the early Muslim conquests, proving that unity, speed, and brilliant strategy could prevail against overwhelming numbers. It is a story of courage that surpassed calculation, of faith that defied fear, a legend etched into the scorched stone of the Syrian desert, reminding us that fate is not written in the size of your army, but in the resolve of your heart. The sword of God had prevailed. The destiny of a world changed forever